Welcome to the user interface lesson where we create our WPF forms. So here I have the application as we left it. Okay, so we set everything up and now it's kind of sitting here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start tweaking this and changing this so that it's all set up for the design of our forms. We're not going to wire anything up yet. We're just going to get the form design set up. And then we can start going into wiring things up individually. Okay, so let's start by creating our main form. Now remember, we had the idea that we'll have just one form essentially, and then different user controls that get put into it. So this main form is just going to be essentially just a menu bar and then a place for our actual control. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here to my grid. I'm going to set up my initial grid. It's really simple. Grid.row definitions. And we're going to say that this has just two row definitions. Row definition 1 is going to have a height of auto. There we go. Height equals auto. And that's it. And then we'll copy that. And I just find it easier than trying to retype it. XAML is not the easiest thing to type in because it doesn't have the idea if I'm here, if I hit double quotes, it's going to add an extra one instead of going past it. So it makes you go back to the mouse a lot. So I'm not a big fan. They have made some improvements in here, but I typically copy and paste a lot more because of the fact that it's just not quite as keyboard friendly as I'd like. And I'm sure there's probably shortcuts out there I could learn. The problem is, though, I don't spend enough time in XAML to really want to learn all the keyboard shortcuts because everything has keyboard shortcuts. And so I actually don't learn a lot of keyboard shortcuts because it takes more time to learn them than it does just to do this every once in a while. Okay, so we have two rows. The first one is height is auto, meaning it will take up whatever space it needs. And the second one, the height is star, meaning it takes up the rest of the height. Okay, so the first thing we're going to add is our menu. So it's really easy. Just say menu. And we'll say the is main menu is true. And then after that, we also want to put it on grid.row0. Then inside there, we need to have some menu items. So menu item, we'll say the header equals underscore file. And what that does, the underscore allows us, when we hit the Alt key, to then hit that letter. So notice if I hit the Alt key in Visual Studio, notice how the file, the F is underscored up here in my menu, and the E is underscored, and the V And then inside here, I'm just going to add one thing for now. I may add more things to these later, but for now, I'm going to have the exit. So exit actually has an underscore at the X. All right, so there's exit. And we'll add a click event. Oops. We don't need to have the closing tag. We can just have a self-closing tag. So both of those were valid, to either have the self-closing tag or the tag at the end. Some only allow self-closing tags, but in this case we have either because it can have content inside. So this self-closing tag means open and close this tag. So we're going to have this called exit. We'll actually have this do something eventually. And what that's going to do, let's make a little more room here. What it's going to do is actually close the application. Now it's tempting to wire this up right now. We're not going to do that. Okay. We are going to give it a name though. x:\name equals, we'll call this the exit menu item. That way we can reference this, and it's going to be called exit menu item underscore click when we add the click event. Okay, so that's enough to give us, notice the file menu and the exit. Now this is really rather small, so let's say font size equals 18. We won't get too crazy with formatting this, but we want to make sure that we can see things. So there's a font size of 18, and now it looks like it should. In fact, if we want to run this, we can. And we have the file menu and the exit. Notice if I hit Alt, it underscores the F, which I can hit F, and now it underscores the X. And if I hit X, that'd be like if I clicked it, but nothing's going to happen. The other thing I notice is this right here, which I find annoying. This is on by default. And what it is some UI debugging tools. And it puts it right on top of your form, which means you miss things. So I'm not a big fan of this. Now it's on by default, like I said. So what we can do is go to Tools, Options, and in the debugging, if we scroll, uncheck the checkbox for Enable UI Debugging Tool, for example. And now if we start this up again, we have no more tools here. Okay, so that's, if you want to get that cleaned up, that's the way to do it. Now I also notice that main window just says main window. Let's change that to be our build time app by Tim Corey. Okay. So now we have our file menu done, but let's add our other menu items that we're going to need. So the next one we're going to need is for clients. Now here's the issue right now. We don't have a lot of sub menu items. We just have basically go to clients, go to, and so we could either have them be, if you clicked file, it would actually go to something. So if this is clients, we'd click on it and go right to it. That's not really a great menu design. That's not how people expect it to work. So instead, I am going to add a drop down that's for all the different editors. So let's call this menu item. Menu item, we'll say the header is editors. Now, you may have noticed that edit, oops, if I hit, that's not one, come on. There we go. I was trying to hit the Alt, but it kept giving me problems because of where I was at. Notice that the edit menu is E, and I'm saying editors. And that's a choice here. I could say, I'm going to reserve that in case I ever were to use that, but the reality is I won't be using that. Therefore, I'm going to leave it as editors. It's up to you if you want to do that or not, if you want to get that far down the rabbit hole of protecting the standard ones. But in this case, I'm not. Okay, so this one is going to be the payment menu item. And this will be payment. And we'll do another one. And this one is going to be the work menu item. This is where we look back over the work we've done. And we'll just call this work for now. I may come back and clean this up if we find it's confusing, but I think that for now it's pretty clear. and then we'll do defaults. Defaults menu item. And I think that's going to be it. Now, the one that we don't have is a way to go back to main, which usually is under the file menu. So let's add that in the file menu right here. And we'll say this is the main. We're just calling main the screen where we actually enter the information for doing work. Okay, that's the screen we're normally on. And this is going to just be called, we can call it main. I think that works. Okay, and now I did want one more menu item just to be complete. And that's something you should always have in some shape or form. And that's the help menu. Only here we'll just have one item in it, and it will be the about menu item. And at the very least, that tells you who created the app and where you can get more information or help. Now, if you actually have help files, which are great, then this would be the main menu you put them under, obviously. Okay, so that just gives us our 3 menu items. If we run this, let's pull it over here. We see that file, main, and exit. Editors are client, payment, work, and defaults, and help and about. Okay, so that's our menu. Now we need to add a place for our content or our actual forms to go, which is right down here. So for example, we might want to put, let's do margin, and it's going to be left is 0 and top and bottom is 10. That's like, so let's not add anything to the top. Let's add 0, 0, and 10. That gives us a little bit of space below our menu before it gets crunched up against with our content control. So it gives it a little bit of space. So just so you know, this margin, it's going to be left, top, right, bottom. Okay, and if you only have 2, it's going to be left, right, top, bottom. All right? It's unfortunately one spot off from what we do in CSS in HTML. So that's a little unfortunate, but otherwise it is what it is. So left, top, right, bottom. Just remember that rotation. So it goes clockwise from the 9 o'clock position through. Okay, so that's the margin. Okay, so now we have our content control. I think we're good on this form. Now we can start adding our new forms, which are actually controls. So let's add a new form to our build time app. Now, the one thing that can happen is as you start adding different items, this gets rather cluttered in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say add a new folder on the build time project. I'm going to call this the controls. And so anything in there will be the controls I'm going to display on this form. So right click and say add user control. That just gives you a shortcut to Okay, and you start off with this blank slate, doesn't even have a background, which is okay because we want this to be transparent and use the background out of this window. Okay, so now let's go down and start adding our items. There we go, that's the better tabbing here. Let's start adding our items to our control. So the first thing I want to do is I want to add the grid setup. So grid dot, let's start with rows, row definitions. And we want the row definition and the rows have a height. And so we're going to say auto. I'm going to copy that. And I'm looking at our drawing and we have 5 rows that we're using. The first one's the client dropdown. Then after that's the hours and the start timer. Then we have the title and description. And then the submit button. So that's 5 rows. So let's just do 5 rows. We'll make the last one, 6 rows. We'll make the last one the star, which means it's going to take up the rest of the space. That's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The last one being star. Okay, so there's our grid row definition. And then we need to think about columns. And do we need columns or not? And by looking at our design right now, I don't see us needing columns. I think what we'll do instead is we'll have stack panels if we want things next to each other or maybe on top of each other but connected. So I'm going to leave off the idea of columns and just have rows. Let's also make this fit like so. These things apart. That way it's very obvious as you scan down through it visually what the different sections are. I kind of like that because it allows for a quick and easy scan to say, here's where we're at. I also like to have that one blank row or spot right here, this one blank line, that gives us a little bit of separation between the different sections. Otherwise, it just gets crunched up together and it's a mess. So we're going to start off with a stack panel. And the reason I use a stack panel is because I want to have both the title and the drop down itself. So it's going to say client and then have the client drop down. And I want to keep those two together. Now we have a choice here. Do you want the label to be on the left of the drop down or above the drop down? And I think for me, I'm going to want to have this above the drop down just to keep that nice, clean, vertical form and not have quite so much width to it. So I'm going to say that the orientation is vertical and that the grid.row is on row 0. Notice it matches up with my comment here. All right, and so now inside the stack panel, I can just add items and they'll stack on top of each other. So the first one is going to be a text block. We don't need to give it a name if we don't need to, and we don't need to. So I'm going to say this is a text block. I think that's all we really need. And we can say client right above. Now let's go ahead and change the font size here for everybody to be 18. Getting a lot larger. Now, don't forget this is way zoomed out. We're at 64%. So 100% looks more like that. Also, the background is transparent, but it will be white when we're actually working with it. So let's fit all. And now we can say as a text box client, and now we can have a drop down, which is called a combo box. Okay, so we'll have our combo box. We need to give us a name, and we're going to say client dropdown. I call them dropdowns versus combo box, but it's really up to you how you want to name it, just so you're clear and consistent. Okay, so this is the dropdown. We're going to leave it like so. We're not going to fill it in yet. We're not going to worry about anything else there. We're just going to leave it like it is. So now we can do row 1. And we can start adding in our other items. So we need a vertical stack panel for hours, but then I wanted to have next to it on the right a button that says Start Timer. And that's going to be next to it. And so I want it on the same line, so therefore it needs a horizontal stack panel. So we actually need 2 different stack panels here. So let's start off with our stack panel. Orientation is going to be horizontal, and the grid.row is row 1. And then we're going to have immediately a stack panel whose orientation is vertical and no grid.row. Now inside this one, we're going to have our text block, and we're going to call it hours. And then we're going to have our text box that's going to be X name, and it will be the hours text box. And that should be it for it. And so it's going to be, we enter the hours here, and then below our stack panel, so next to our stack panel, we're going to have a button. And this button's name is going to be Operate Timer. And we're going to say, let's call it Start Timer. Okay. Now notice everything's crunched together right now. We're going to worry about that in just a minute. I'm just getting this stuff on the page, then we'll make it pretty. Okay. So we're going to add some margins in here and all the rest. But for now, I think that what we'll do is we'll just leave it and just start putting things in first. Okay. If you start getting lost on the cleaning things up, then you sometimes lose your place where you're at. So let's do row 2. And this is going to be the title. And now we just need one more row, row 4, and that's going to be the submit button. So we need a button. Notice no stack panel because we only have one thing. Submit form. And we'll just call it submit for now. Might change it to something else, but I think that works. Oh, and one last thing, I need to make sure it's on grid.row number 4. Otherwise, it's going to overwrite what's in grid 0. So there we go. So we have row 0, row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4. Very clear where everything is. And even if it gets a little bit complicated in the specific row, you know you're looking at just that one row. All right, so let's make our life a little bit easier. For right now, we're going to say that the background is white, just to give us a better look at our form. We can take that off in a little bit. But Then also let's start working on our layout. Now, it looks like my font size isn't actually applying to everything. Not sure why. Oh, of course. So again, I got bit by we're not at 100%. So that's why. So let's make this a little bit bigger, and then we'll just resize this. Oh, let's resize this so it's now in our box. Looks a little better. Those fonts are actually a little larger than they seem to be. So, but it's all proportional. Okay. So now let's start talking about how we can make this cleaner and prettier. So the first thing I can see is we need spacing, a lot of spacing, because everything gets jammed up right underneath the last control. So we can do it in a few different ways. I think the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to address the spacing on the first row, and then we'll kind of go from there. So let's do padding, or actually do margin. So margin and padding are pretty close in what they're doing. But let's start with give me 5 away from the edge, and I give you 5 everywhere. But then let's do 5 from the left, and let's do 5 from the top and 5 from the right, and 10 down below. Okay, so let's put our cursor off that. We actually put it down here, and it gets all the grid lines away. So there we go. So there's what it looks like if I have 5 above, 10 below. Now, if I did that for this one as well, that 5 above is going to add to the 10 below and make it 15 between each one. We'll see if that is okay or if you want to make some adjustments there. So let's do that. And now, again, I'll put my cursor at the end of the grid and look at it. And it looks pretty good. I like that. In fact, let's look at it at 100% just to make sure. And I think that's pretty good. So we have, a little bit extra spacing here, and that's okay. Of course, this is jammed up still, but now it feels about right. And that's really what it comes down to. I'm not a super great designer, but at the same time, if something's ugly, then I think that I can probably adjust it. So let's make it not ugly. All right. So now that's our form with a spacing between each item. I think that's pretty good. Now, before we go any further, let's look at these fonts here. I'm not a huge fan, and we can change these manually, but we can also go over here to the properties and look at the font. So right now it's the, however you pronounce that, Sago, I'm not quite sure. Let's look at a few more just to see if we can't find something that's a little bit better. So maybe Open Sans. And notice we're looking at the client right here as opposed to these down here. I think it's a little bit better. Again, not a huge designer, but I kind of like that. So let's go ahead and cut this out of this text block and then come up here and paste it into our user control. So notice it makes everything a little bigger, and it changed the fonts a little bit to be a little bit more modern, I guess you'd say. So I think I like that. Now that I have that, I can start looking at the different controls and how they're laid out. Also looking at how wide this thing is. It doesn't need to be this wide. So let's address now the hours section, because that's all jammed up. So the first thing I'll look at is our text box. So we can do the minimum width and just start throwing numbers in here and seeing how it feels to us. Since it's a number, I think 100 is probably fine. It gives us a good enough space and allows us to put in any number we want for hours that's reasonable and not exceed that box. In fact, we'll probably use only a portion of that box. So I think that's fine. Now let's do a margin on this stack panel right here, which is the hours and the text box. We'll do a margin on the right. So margin equals 0, 0. Let's do 20, 0. Okay. And notice that button moved over to the right because of our margin on the right. Okay, so I think that looks a little better, gives it a little more space, and I think it looks about right. The button itself is a little bit funky because the start and the R, the S and start and the R on the timer, they're right against the edge. So let's change that to have some internal padding. And we're going to say that the padding is, let's start off at 5 and 0 on top and bottom. And let's look at that. I think that looks better. Now, we can, if you wanted to, move those tops and bottoms down. But I think that, we could play around it, but I think it's going to look fine as it is. Let's just play around a bit and say that the left and right is 0 and the top and bottom is 5. That kind of crunches down a little bit. Let's make it more like 10. And there you go. We could do something like that if we wanted to. We could also move it to the bottom if we wanted to line up this button. I think, though, that I kind of like it being a little bigger. I like buttons to be big enough that if you did have a touch screen, you could touch it and it wouldn't be like you're going off a screen. So let's actually take out the margin entirely. I think that still works. I think it still looks okay and allows for a nice big clickable timer button. And let's make the padding on the left and right larger to be proportionate to how the button actually looks. In fact, let's make it 15. There we go. Okay, so now we have our hours and our start timer. We have our title and description. They're very long, but they're fitting whatever is available in the cell, just like these drop downs are. So let's bring this back by let's keep going. We'll address these in a minute when we bring back the form. But let's look at the description's fine, the title is fine, the submit button is quite large and has no margin top and bottom. So no padding. Which we can do by looking at the design width and saying, you know what, we want this to be more like 400. And there we go. So there's our form now at a more reasonable width. However, description only has one line. So let's address that by going down to our description and making some modifications to our text box. The first thing we want to add is text wrapping equals wrap. That allows us to bring content to the second line. And then also accept returns equals true. And now we can just deal with the height and say, let's just try 50 and say, you know what, let's do even higher. Let's do 80 and see how it looks. And it looks pretty good. I think that gives us more of a multi-line description that's obvious. And if it scrolls a little bit, that's okay. But that way we can put in more content than just what the title has. Okay, so there's our form. It's laid out pretty well. I think it'll work. I think it'll pop into our main form rather nicely. We'll also resize this, by the way. So let's make this 450, like so. I think that'll probably work. We'll see when we put it in there. In fact, we're going to do that now just so that we can test out how it's going to look in this control to make sure this control is set up right. And then we can move on and design our other forms. Okay, so we'll do a little bit of demo work here, which in our code behind for our main window, I'm just going to say that the content, which is our content control, equals new And then we're going to say that it's the main control, which we have to add a using statement for. So control dot, new main control, and that's going to pop it right in when we start the application. Let's start this and see how it looks. And I got nothing here. So let's find out why I've got nothing. There should be something in this box, and there is nothing. Okay, so I think I see the issue. I just said content, which is a full control, and that's not okay because I'm trying to overwrite that full control with this new control, this full item. So this right down here, I'm trying to overwrite the entire thing with something new. Instead, what I want to do is I want to say content dot content. So this is the control name. This is the actual property I want to fill. Let's try it again. And now, there we go. So we've got the menus that are working. We've got, this is rather crunched on here. I want it to be a little bit smaller, and also notice how I have to resize this a little bit larger in order to get the submit button in. So make the form a little taller. I'm going to put some margins around the actual content control, and I'll make the actual form a little wider. So this is a little bit of tweaking here. The width, we're going to make 500. The height, we'll make 500 as well. And now let's add some margins around our content control. We'll say the margin is, let's go with 20 left and right, and top and bottom are, well, actually 20 on the left, top is 0, right is 20, and bottom is 20. How about that? We already have a space up here, and we want it to be kind of tucked up against our file, but not crazy tight. And there we go. So there's our layout. I think that works. I think it's small enough to be a minor app. You can probably sit in the corner or something like that if you wanted to put it on a screen somewhere. You can make it even smaller if you didn't want to have these fonts quite so big. Or if you wanted to do something like this, you could do that as well. I think that works still. I mean, if we put testing new form for client, and we did a lot of work, a lot of work on our new system, I think it looks great. I mean, that still works, I think. So even a smaller width, I might actually like a little more. So we might make this a little bit smaller. We'll play around with that and see what works. But maybe we come back over here and say that our width is more like 400. Maybe actually 350. Let's try that out just to see. We're just kind of playing around, see what works, and then that'll help us design the other forms. And I think that works. So now it's a compact little app, even though the text is quite large. And we can make that smaller if you wanted to, but especially on video, I didn't want to make it smaller. So I think this works for this form at least. Now the next thing will be is if we can get the other form to conform to this size. All right. So for this one, the design width is more like 300, which is about right. So it's 300 by probably more like 400 is the height. Maybe 425. That's about right. Okay. So there's our design height and design width. Now notice that these are design height and design width because these don't actually apply to what I'd call the real world, which is once you actually put it into place, once you put it into your main window. Because your main window controls how the height and width actually are for the control, which is why you want to make sure you're not just dragging and dropping controls onto your form. Because if you are, then what happens is you have these different controls that have set fixed widths and fixed heights. And then if you were to resize your form, nothing happens. It just cuts things off. And so that's not what we want. We want to have we want to take advantage of the power of WPF for resizing. Okay, so instead of pushing on and trying to create all the rest of the controls in this video, I think what we'll do is we'll take a pause right here. This will allow you to catch up, make sure that you've done what we've done here, done what I've done here, and let you play around a little bit with what you've learned so far. Because it's really important to understand what's going on before you just continue and do it again and again. Otherwise, you know how to do something, but not why to do something. And so I would encourage you, before you move on, to make sure you build this, and then make sure you understand how the different things affect your layouts. So things like the stack panel and the grid layout and the margins and padding and what the difference is. Okay, so margin is the outside padding, essentially, or outside spacing. Padding is the inside spacing. Okay, for some things it doesn't really matter, but especially for buttons it does. So just play around with different things. Make sure that you're laying things out. Make sure you understand why you're doing what you're doing, and then from there move on to the next lesson.